Hey class, today we're going to talk about FDR and the first New Deal. So, America was going through the Great Depression, and as you read in your lesson yesterday, Herbert Hoover was not really seen as someone who responded to the threat that the Great Depression was very well. Herbert Hoover responded more with the idea of volunteerism, which was businesses, it was telling businesses don't get rid of people, don't cut hours, don't cut wages, but just try to do your best to accommodate the economy and accommodate America during the struggling time. Um, he initially said that the Great Depression wasn't that big of a deal. Initially it may not have looked that way, but the Great Depression became a big deal as more and more businesses started going under in response to people defaulting on debt. A lot of people, like stockbrokers, lending irresponsibly to their buyers. So as Herbert Hoover's presidency goes on, a lot of people became disenchanted with him, and he stood basically no chance whatsoever of being reelected. So when FDR runs for election in the 1932 election, he very easily wins. He's going to be inaugurated in 1933 because, as always, presidential elections happen in an even year, but the inauguration happens in an odd year. So our elections now, they're in November, and the inauguration now happens in January. It used to be a long time ago that the inaugurations would happen in March. But anyway, FDR is inaugurated, and he very aggressively attempts to deal with the Great Depression during what's termed his first 100 days. So his idea was one of massive governmental intervention, whereas Herbert Hoover's idea was one of minimal governmental intervention. And, in some ways, I don't know that that's an entirely fair assessment of Herbert Hoover, but that's usually how he's judged. He did use government funds to attempt to distribute some economic relief, but it wasn't really on the scale that people wanted. And after he had the reputation of someone who underestimated the impact of the Depression or really just didn't care about the Depression, once he had that label, really there wasn't a whole lot that he was able to do to turn that view of him around. Whereas FDR came right out of the gate very aggressive, very hard in dealing with the Depression. So he pushed for massive governmental intervention, and he did a lot of things which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. One of the first things that he does is something called bank holidays. So when he gets into office, he just closes down banks. And he's like, we're closing down banks for a week. We're going to evaluate which banks are fiscally stable and which banks are not. And those that are, we'll allow them to reopen. We'll put some safety nets in place. Those that aren't, they're done. They are shut down permanently. And the goal of this was twofold. First and foremost, it was to try to stop bank runs, because bank runs were really damaging the banking sector. Banks that were hanging on or were doing okay financially, when everybody in the town would come and pull their money out all at the same time, that would just destroy a bank. It would bankrupt it, which would then in turn cause people that had their money invested in that bank or saved in that bank to lose it. So FDR wanted to stop bank runs, which was one major goal of that. And also he wanted to stop banks from going out of business, because that domino effect of banks going out of business was causing then businesses to go out of business. And as banks continually started closing, people just didn't really feel like they could trust the economic recovery because they didn't see any sign of it happening. So if banks were seen as more stable, then more people would be likely to start putting their money back in banks, which would then allow for funding of businesses and allow for funding of things like home building, car buying, and the economy might come back to life again. But if people aren't putting their money into banks, banks don't have that capital to lend out. So other things that FDR did, he did what was called fireside chats. So he would give updates. He would just give talks to America. They were labeled fireside chats, kind of like a friendly little talk about the state of America. Kind of something kind of like Donald Trump did during COVID, where he would have like the daily COVID briefings. Those weren't quite the tone that FDR would have used, but the daily COVID updates early on, when like March, April in 2020, those are somewhat akin to FDR's fireside chats, except FDR's fireside chats were more along the lines of just kind of like a nice fatherly talk beside the fire, soothing, reassuring, not a bunch of press interviews with like rapid fire questions either, like Trump's COVID briefings were often. But the idea was just to reaffirm during the Great Depression, FDR reaffirming America's okay, that America's going to recover and we're well on the way to recovery. And then part of FDR's New Deal, the first New Deal, we're going to talk about the second New Deal in upcoming lessons. But the first New Deal was a lot of smaller programs, governmental programs to try to boost the economy. So things like the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, not AAA, the American Automobile Association. That's a totally different thing. But the AAA was supposed to help struggling farmers. There was the NRA, not the National Rifle Association. That's a different thing. This is the National Recovery Administration. And this was supposed to provide solidarity in the business environment. Businesses associated with the NRA vowed to pay a minimum wage, among other things, and people were encouraged to support those businesses that were doing that, and to not patronize businesses that weren't a part of that. There were a lot of other, they're called three-letter agencies. Sometimes they're referred to as alphabet soup agencies. But there are a lot of other three-letter agencies like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they went around doing public works. They were hired by the government with government funding through tax money to do a lot of public works, like Raccoon Creek State Park and other state parks in the state of Pennsylvania. Some of their trails and their cabins that exist, and some of the buildings, the outbuildings that exist in some of our state parks, were actually constructed by people who are working as part of the CCC. There was also the PWA, the Public Works Administration, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the Tennessee Valley Authority, it actually still exists today. It was employing people in the Tennessee Valley to build things like dams and to do big public works projects that would benefit people in the Tennessee Valley, either with hydroelectric power or just water regulations so there wasn't as much flooding. So the idea of the first New Deal is just make a lot of government programs that will hire a lot of people so that those who are out of work can, at least temporarily, these were not like long-term jobs where someone would have a career, like a lifetime career in this. These were short-term jobs where someone would work for a couple of months and they would receive a steady paycheck from the government, and they would be able to at least better their situation for a little while. And the goal here is just to help bring some people out of abject poverty if they had completely lost their job. Some families completely lost their farms and lost their land. So the goal was to use these three-letter agencies to either regulate the economy, as with subsidies with farmers, like give farmers money to help them out of a situation, or to offer jobs through the government, like with the PWA and the CCC and the TVA. And this was all part of the first New Deal. And America, generally speaking, was really excited at first about the first New Deal. FDR was a very charismatic person. He had a very energizing personality. He just really inspired confidence. He was someone who had had polio as an adult, which was rare. Polio was also called infantile paralysis. And so he actually couldn't walk very well or very far without braces and canes. Oftentimes he was in a wheelchair. But this is a time when the press was much kinder to presidents. And most of America didn't even know that. But those in government that did know that, they were given a sense of confidence that someone had overcome that and was able to adapt to that and take charge in the nation. So someone that had faced a grave illness, uh, had been affected by it, but had overcome it, was just really celebrated by the people in the government. But the press really shielded the president. They never took a picture of him in a wheelchair. They never took a picture of him with his braces, his leg braces on. They always showed him in the best light so that America was encouraged, and would be able to just see that image of FDR really being stalwart. So during this time period, people are super excited about what's going on with FDR for the most part. They're excited about the economy seeming to get back on track. But there are some people who are not on board because they feel like the government's taking a major chunk of power that it isn't necessarily given in the Constitution. So things that FDR did, like banning ownership of gold by executive order. So he just signs an executive order. And he's like, it's illegal to own gold. Turn all your gold in. All your government minted gold needs to be turned in so that the currency can be inflated, so that the gold ratio can be changed from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce, and new gold coins be minted. So things like that, or FDR allowing for the manufacture, sale, and distribution of some alcoholic beverages before prohibition is repealed by constitutional amendment. So he did that with executive order. So some people were looking at these things that he's doing and saying, we don't like this trend, but by and large, a lot of people in America were really hopeful and encouraged by what FDR was doing. All right, so that is it for today. We talked about FDR and the New Deal. And then we are going to talk about the second New Deal and how America really recovers or doesn't recover economically. We'll talk about that, whether it does or not, and what the recovery actually looks like in the next upcoming lesson. All right, have a great day, guys.